Okay, good evening, everybody. Thank you for sticking around until 5:30, and it might be actually much later in some people's time zones or earlier in some other people's time zones. Anyway, thank you very much for showing up for this plenary. It gives me great pleasure to introduce Mandy Simons, who's longtime professor at Carnegie Mellon in the Department of Philosophy, but also the director of the linguistics program at Carnegie Mellon. Mandy, or Dr. Simons, is one of the leading scholars in my mind in semantics and pragmatics, who's been at the forefront of just, almost and shaping a lot of the discussion in semantics and pragmatics for quite a while, working on all the main issues in semantics and pragmatics that you can think about: presupposition, implicature, convention and intention, stuff about bridging implicatures, indefiniteness. The list goes on, and every one of her contributions to these areas is a seminal paper which actually changes the way that people begin to discuss those problems and shapes, subsequent theorizing on these topics. So anyway, I won't spend much more time on this introduction, and we'll hand over to Mandy to give us a talk on conversation without common ground.
Okay, and thank you for that far too flattering introduction. That's a lot to live up to for this talk. Let me just say a few more thank yous before I dive in. First, I want to thank the organizers for inviting me. And like everybody else, express my gratitude for all the work that you guys did to make this happen online after, with 2 days notice. And also I want to thank everybody for being here after a very long day on Zoom. So let me get started. So as I said in my abstract, this talk is a kind of progress report on an ongoing project thinking about how to have a model of conversation without a model of communication without common ground. So I'll first give the background that sort of motivates this project, and then go on from there. So background. So the model of linguistic communication that I grew up with as a graduate student, and that I take to be the dominant model in philosophy of language and in linguistics, at least in North America, is the common ground model of linguistic communication that's due to the seminal work of Robert Stalnaker beginning in the 1970s and going onwards. And the central idea of this model, which I'm sure everyone is familiar with, is that communication involves coordination around a single body of information, the common ground. And in particular, this information plays two core roles. It is the information available to interlocutors for planning and interpreting utterances. And it's also the target of speech acts. So for example, in the framework, the role of assertion is to propose an update to the common ground. The role of a rejection of an assertion is to prevent it being added to the common ground, and so on. Now, common ground theorists, of course, accept that individuals engaged in communication have their own sets of beliefs. The crucial idea is that all the essential explanatory work regarding linguistic choices and communication is supposed to be done by the common ground. And as I said, this has been really the dominant model since the 1970s, and I think gained a lot of sort of fuel from the emergence of dynamic semantic frameworks in the 1980s. there are really important differences between the thinking about context and common ground in dynamic semantics versus in Stalnaker's work, but this is not the place to talk about that. Okay, so like that's the dominant model that I'm responding to. A second sort of family of models has been kind of emerging, I think, since the early 2000s, and these are what I'm going to be calling multiple perspective models. I just want to make a note on my use of the term perspective. I borrowed this terminology from the work of Daphne Heller and Sarah Brown-Schmidt that I'm going to talk about more a little later in the talk. I'm using this term just to refer to an information state, to a set of beliefs or a set of commitments. That term has been used in a different way. It's being used in the sort of social political philosophy of language work, and especially in work on slurs with a somewhat more sort of weighty meaning. And here, where I talk about multiple perspectives, I'm really just talking about multiple information states. So the idea in this family of models is that to have an adequate model of linguistic communication, we need to represent the individual information states or perspectives of the communicators, and that some crucial explanatory work is done by these perspectives. So as I said, there's been sort of emerging evidence and arguments for such models since the 2000s, and I put some of the central references here on the slide. Each theorist here is looking at a specific linguistic phenomenon and arguing for the role of multiple perspectives in modeling it. Now, one of the interesting differences between some of the specific proposals in this family is whether or not they choose to represent, along with the perspectives of each individual, also some representation of the common ground. And the main motivation, the typical motivation for doing that, is the thought that, well, we do still need to talk about common ground to explain the things that are on the slide on the left, the information available to interlocutors, and speech acts like assertion. So relevant here is a different line of work where arguments have been made against the common ground as a model of precisely those things. So in various of my prior papers, I've argued against common ground as a model of presupposition. Dan Harris has a paper from 2020 arguing against common ground as a model of assertion and other speech acts. And in some newer work of mine that's about to come out, I argue against common ground as a model of availability, which, as we'll see, turns out to be very closely related to presupposition. So the goal of my talk today is to argue for the viability of a common ground-free model of conversation, so a multiple perspective model that does not include a representation of the common ground. I'm going to provide some new arguments against the common ground view and in favor of a multiple perspective view based on this notion of availability, which I'll get clearer about shortly. And then I'm going to try to sort of move this forward a bit more by giving a sketch of a non-common ground-based picture of presupposition and of assertion. Although what I can say about assertion at this point is kind of very sketchy and speculative. So let's start by talking about availability. In his 2014 book, early in the presentation, Stalnaker says this. He says, if communication is to be successful, the contextual information on which the content of a speech act depends must be information that is available to the addressee. So this is a pretty uncontroversial thing to say. It looks like Stalnaker is just saying the addressee has to be able to, as it were, get their mental hands on whatever information is needed for interpretation. Stalnaker goes on to say, the development of this point is part of what led to the theory of context as a body of available information, the common ground. So here, obviously, Stalnaker is saying something much more substantive, that the common ground constitutes the information which can be used by interlocutors in planning and interpreting utterances. Let's remember also that Stalnaker adopts a kind of strong epistemic analysis of the notion of common ground. So for Stalnaker, a content C is common ground between two agents A and B, just in case A and B both accept that content for purposes of the conversation. And it is common ground between them that this holds. And then common belief, in turn, is defined in the standard iterated belief way. So A believes that B accepts, and B believes that A accepts, and A believes that B believes that A believes, and so on and so forth. Now, Stalnaker doesn't say in the book, and really says, I don't think really says anywhere why he makes this assumption that common ground is going to play the role of available information. But it's pretty clearly motivated by the sort of standard rationalist story that is articulated by David Lewis and by Stephen Schiffer, that if agents are going to be certain about what is being communicated, then they have to have this iterated belief about the background that they're drawing on for interpretation. This picture starts to get a little wobbly once we really think about what is required for rational communication. And it starts to seem like rational communicative behavior really doesn't require the level of certainty that Lewis and Schiffer proposed. And this is not a new claim. It goes back at least to Sperber and Wilson in 1986, and Harris really reinforces this point in his work. So I think one of the things we want to bear in mind as we go forward and think about this is what really counts as rational communicative behavior. So there are two things I want to say about availability. First, that the notion of availability that Stalnaker has in mind is a normative one and not what I would call a practical one. And second, that the common ground is not a good model of either the normative or the practical notion of availability. So to wrap our heads around this, it's helpful to think about accommodation. Thinking about accommodation really brings out this distinction between the normative and what I'm calling the practical notion. And the specific case of accommodation I want to look at involves retrieving the required background assumptions for deriving a relevance implicature. So here's the example, and this is an example I'm going to come back to in various versions through the talk. So the cast of characters here are Abby, Bella, and Ned. So imagine that they are fairly recent acquaintances. Maybe they're like new work acquaintances. They've been hanging out a bit together, and they're kind of aware that they don't all know the same things about one another. And one day they have Abby and Bella are together, and they have this conversation. Abby invites Bella to lunch. Bella says, sure. And then she says, should we invite Ned? And Abby says, well, it's Ramadan. And let's assume that what Abby intends is to implicate that it's not appropriate to invite Ned to lunch because, in fact, Ned is observing the fast. Now, in order to derive this implicature, Bella would need at least two pieces of information. First, you need to know in general what Ramadan is, and in particular that those who observe it don't eat during the day. And she'd also need the information that Ned has the practice of observing Ramadan, or at least he's likely to have this practice. So I want you to consider a scenario where Bella is informed about Ramadan, but she has no beliefs about Ned's practice of Ramadan. So the standard story to tell here is that Bella will accommodate this background assumption and derive the intended implicature. So what do we mean by accommodation? Well, informally, we use this term to talk about a hearer taking on information that is apparently assumed by the speaker for purposes of interpretation. The notion gets different specific definitions in different places in the literature. Let's just focus on Stalnaker's characterization of the notion. So for Stalnaker, accommodation is a process whereby the speaker and the hearer transparently change their beliefs about the common ground status of some information, resulting in what was non-common ground information becoming common ground. And once the beliefs have changed in this way, the information is available for the interlocutors. So let me highlight here something that's kind of obvious, but still doesn't usually get highlighted, which is the last point I made, that accommodation is a process whereby some required background information is first retrieved or constructed by a listener and then becomes common ground. Now, every model of every common ground-based model assumes some process of accommodation. So clearly, every common ground model assumes that a listener has this ability to identify, retrieve some relevant piece of non-common ground information and change their beliefs about it such that it becomes common ground. But that means that common ground is not a model of what I would call retrievability. It's not a model of what I was previously calling some practical notion of availability. So going back to this quote from Stalnaker, when he said this, he actually doesn't mean what I attributed to him. He's not talking about, he's not saying for communication to be successful, the addressee must be able to get their mental hands on the contextual information they need to interpret. What he's saying is the contextual information needed for interpretation should be normatively available to the addressee. So again, when Stalnaker talks about availability, he's not talking about what a listener can get their mental hands on. He's talking about a normative notion. But for empirical purposes, if our goal is to explain when interpretation succeeds and when it doesn't, we need this model of what I'm calling practically available or retrievable information, borrowing that last term from Craig Roberts. Okay, so now we've got this notion of retrievability in mind. Here's the main argument that I'm going to give against the common ground model as a model of availability. Going to observe that listeners retrieve and use information that is assumed by speakers without themselves accepting it. And if somebody in the conversation doesn't accept this proposition, then it's not common ground. So let me illustrate this. I'm going to give a couple of illustrative examples. Let's just go back to the Ramadan case and tweak it a little bit. So suppose in this case that Abby is actually mistaken about Ned observing Ramadan, and Bella is aware that she is incorrect. So we could imagine the conversation going like this. Bella asks, should we invite Ned to lunch? And Abby says, well, it's Ramadan. And Bella says, yeah, but Ned isn't observing Ramadan. Now, what is of interest here? The first thing that's of interest is that, of course, Bella is just as able to retrieve the background assumption, the assumption Abby is making that Ned is observing Ramadan, despite the fact that she doesn't think that it's true. And she's just as able to use it in deriving Abby's intended implicature, even though she doesn't think that it's true. So clearly, a hearer can utilize non-common ground information to interpret a speaker's utterance. Now, one response that that one gets from common ground theorists to observations like these is sort of along the following lines. People say, well, okay, so speakers and hearers can do this. They do manage to identify the intended interpretation, but that's not really what the common ground theory is supposed to be a theory of. It's supposed to be a theory of what is normatively correct. Well, how do we decide what is normatively correct in conversation? I would suggest that one sort of diagnostic we can use for an appropriate notion of normative correctness is that agents in a conversation are behaving in the ways that their interlocutors expect. And we have to sort of flag here that we're talking about cases of sort of fairly cooperative conversation. So in this case, Abby is hardly going to be surprised that Bella successfully uses in interpretation this assumption that she, Bella, does not share. So the use of such information seems proper. It's what the speaker would expect. I'm going to skip this example for reasons of time. I'm probably already going too slowly. I want to look at this example that involves insinuation. So I'm borrowing from Liz Camp a view of insinuation, at least this category of insinuation cases, as being very much like conversational implicature, but involving the construction of a set of background assumptions that are not necessarily, typically not shared between the speaker and the hearer. So consider an example like this. A is a female executive whose colleagues are all male, and they've signaled to her in various ways very clearly that, you know, she's not welcome in their team as a woman. Moreover, she's currently pregnant. And suppose she's just volunteered to take on a demanding task as part of preparation for an upcoming event. And one of the male colleagues, B, says, well, maybe you shouldn't take that on, seeing as you're about to have a baby and all. And we can imagine that B's intention, which is recognized by A, is to insinuate that once she has this baby, she's not really going to be able to do her job. Maybe that they hope she's not going to be working for them anymore once she has a baby, something along those lines. Now, clearly, we can imagine that A is able to retrieve this intended interpretation, but also clearly does not accept the sort of misogynistic assumptions that underlie that implication. So here, and moreover, what makes this case different from the case of error in the previous example is that this is a case where the speaker is well aware that the hearer, who is expected to retrieve the insinuation, does not accept the background assumptions on which derivation of that insinuation is based. So here's the summary so far. Cases of error, like the Ramadan with error case, and differences in perspective suggest that speakers and hearers treat as available, that is, as appropriately used in interpretation, whatever is inferentially retrievable and plausibly attributed to the speaker as an assumption. The common ground is obviously not a good model of this, and clearly not intended as such, given accommodation as a part of the theory. So instead, common ground is intended as a normative model, but we don't actually hold interlocutors to be normatively inappropriate when they behave in the ways that I just described. So common ground is not a useful model of normatively available information either, as long as we're willing to take the relevant notion of normativity to be relative to creatures like us. Okay, so that's the negative part. What's the positive part? So now let me give you a picture of availability in a multiple perspective model. And the model I'm going to adopt that I already mentioned is due to fairly recently published work by Daphne Hello and Sarah Brown-Schmidt, what they call the multiple perspectives theory. So I'm just going to give a very high-level quick sketch of what that theory looks like. This is an explicitly cognitive theory, so it offers a model of the representations that are maintained by each individual engaging the conversation. The idea is that each individual maintains two different kinds of representation. First, the individual has a self-perspective, which represents the conversationally relevant information that they are willing to draw on right now in speaking and interpreting. The agent also maintains for each interlocutor what we can call an interlocutor perspective. This is so the mirror of the self perspective, but in this case, the agent can typically only infer what information they should attribute to the to their interlocutors. There's a second part of a further part of the theory that I'm not really going to say very much about, which is a comparison process between the maintained perspectives. So Heller and Brown-Schmidt proposed that at relevant points in conversation, the agent carries out this comparison process, the output of which might affect either production choices or interpretation choices. Crucially, though, in their model, the output of this process does not sort of feed into a new representation. So on their model, there is no maintained representation of shared or common ground information. So let's think about how we can talk about availability in a model of this sort. So here's our Ramadan example again. And let's stick with this case where Abby is assuming that Ned is observing Ramadan, and Bella is aware that this is incorrect. So what makes the proposition that Ned observes Ramadan available to Bella as hearer? So the story goes something like this. I mean, I think the picture is probably fairly clear, but I'll just go through it anyway. So here's Bella developing a representation of self and interlocutor as they have this conversation. And they're talking about going to lunch, and she's having the conversation with Abby, and she's about to say something about Ned. So presumably her self-perspective contains, some beliefs about lunch and beliefs about Abby and beliefs about Ned. And at this point in the conversation, quite plausibly, Bella's model of Abby's perspective is pretty much a mirror of her own. But then Abby says it's Ramadan. So now Bella adds to her self-perspective various beliefs that she has about Ramadan. But amongst other things, she still expects that Abby's remark is going to be relevant to her suggestion about inviting Ned. But adding her beliefs about Ramadan to her own perspective does not generate any relevant inferences. So now she's going to ask herself, what do things look like from Abby's perspective? So now she may have been assuming that Abby's beliefs about Ned were the same as hers, but of course this can be modified. So she can add here to Abby's assumptions, the assumption that Ned is observing Ramadan, and now she can generate from Abby's perspective a relevant inference. That is an inference that's relevant to the suggestion that they invite Ned to lunch. So on this story, assumptions that a hearer can plausibly attribute to the speaker are part of the information available to the hearer. If we want to make this more explicit, we can say this: the assumption Ned is observing Ramadan is available to Bella because it is within the competence of the hearer, Bella, to work out or grasp intuitively that this supposition is required. And if you read your Grice as often as I do, you will realize that I'm quoting Grice here. And I quote Grice partly just to demonstrate that, what I'm saying here is not something radically new. It's really just what Grice always said about how intention recognition proceeds. So crucially, what follows from this is that what's available to the hearer is not restricted to what she accepts, even for purposes of the conversation, but it includes what she can reconstruct as possible presumptions of the speaker. So in summary, a multiple perspective model explains the kind of hypothetical reasoning about the information states of others that seems to underlie interpretation in cases of mismatched information. Okay, so multiple perspectives gives a way of talking about availability, but is it enough to talk about presupposition and assertion, the two central problems or phenomena that the common ground model was really developed to account for? So I'm going to start by talking about presupposition. And just to kind of give away the punchline, I've really already given you my theory of presupposition. It's just a theory of available information. And then if I have time left, I'll say a very little bit about assertion. So first, let me get us all on the same page, talking about presupposition. The kind of thing that I have in mind are the inferences derivable from a variety of sentence types. So, for example, if I say Phil's kids are unruly, you'll conclude that I have kids, that Phil has kids. And the same is true if I utter the negation, Phil's kids aren't unruly. And this sharing of implications between affirmative and negative sentences is one of the core diagnostics of presuppositional content. Similarly, if I say Jane has left the house today, you'll take me to be assuming that Jane was in the house today. But if I negate it, Jane hasn't left the house today, the same implication survives. Jane knows that it's raining, or Jane doesn't know that it's raining, gives rise to the implication that it's raining. And crucially, the utterance of "it's Ramadan" as a response to the question, should we invite Ned to lunch, generates a contextual, what I have called a contextual presupposition that Ned observes Ramadan. So the current view on presuppositions, I think the most widely accepted view, is that presuppositions are constraints imposed on the common ground by an utterance. When presuppositional constraints are not met, infelicity or a failure to update ensues. And another sort of I think, assumed benefit of the common ground view of presupposition is that certain other properties of presupposition seem to be explained in terms of the common ground requirement. So the sense that presuppositions are taken for granted seems to make sense, given the construal of these as common ground, as information that's required to be in the common ground. There are a variety of empirical disadvantages of the common ground view. I'm not going to review all of this here. I think the central observation that's now been fairly well established is that most presupposition triggers have felicitous informative uses, and this is plausibly true of all non-anaphoric triggers. Now, this isn't news to the common ground view. And the standard response to this is that listeners can accommodate required presuppositions. The central difficulty with that is that accommodation actually seems to, if we understand things as working in this way, then accommodation seems to be the default strategy. And this seems to raise a question for how the purported common ground constraints could be learnable or maintained. I want to give some new evidence against the common ground view, which is right here on the slide. So it's typically held that speakers cannot appropriately presuppose what has been rejected, content that's been rejected by their addressees, something that hasn't made its way into the common ground. But actually, there are circumstances in which it is perfectly felicitous to do that. So here's an example. A and B are having a conversation, and A says, "Turns out that Phil has 2 kids." "What? No, he doesn't. Phil doesn't have kids." "Well, I saw him with his kids at the weekend." Maybe you saw him with his nephews or something. "Really, Phil doesn't have kids." "I'm telling you, he's bringing his kids to the party. He might even bring his kids to the pool today." "I still don't believe you're delusional." Okay, so the critical thing here is that the question of whether or not Phil has kids clearly remains at issue throughout this conversation. B holds it to be true. A rejects, sorry, got it backwards. A holds it to be true and B rejects it. Nonetheless, I at least find it perfectly felicitous for A to continue to use the referring expression, his kids, Phil's kids, throughout the conversation. And I don't even find this particularly tendentious. It's just the most straightforward way for A to continue to make the assertions that she wants to make. Here's a second example. I'll let you guys read it. I don't need to do the performance. So here the background assumption that A is asserting and B rejecting is that Sam was in Pittsburgh. And here we've got 3 different presuppositional expressions, still, left, well, I guess 2 expressions, still and the verb leave, which can be appropriately and comprehensibly used by A, despite the fact that the presupposition that they require is rejected by B. So what does the story look like? How do I think presupposition works? Well, as I said, I've actually already given you my view of what presuppositions are, which fits in very nicely with the multiple perspectives theory. The idea is simply that the presuppositions of an utterance are assumptions which the listener must attribute to the speaker in order for that speaker, in order for the utterance to be conversationally appropriate. And as long as the listener can attribute that assumption to the speaker without rendering the speaker incoherent, then the presupposition is satisfied. So to put this in words, presuppositions of an utterance are those contents that the hearer must attribute to the speaker to take the speaker's utterance as conversationally reasonable. And again, within a multiple perspective model where we assume that the listener is, well, we assume that each agent is maintaining a representation of their interlocutors, this makes perfect sense. Now, a worry you might very plausibly have here is this, that, look, there are cases of presuppositional, the uses of presuppositional expressions where we have no trouble figuring out what the speaker is presuming, but nonetheless, the utterance appears infelicitous. And I call these fire truck cases because of examples like this one. Sorry, I'm late. My fire truck wouldn't start, which everyone recognizes as being kind of somehow an odd thing to say, even if, in fact, you do get around in a fire truck. I don't have a fully worked out story on these, but this is my speculation, that this is a social violation rather than a linguistic one. It's a social violation because there's some kind of expectation that if you know your interlocutor is going to want to discuss some information that you are about to introduce into the conversation, you should do that in a conversational move that facilitates that discussion. And for reasons that would need another talk to elaborate on, that's not the case when you introduce information presuppositionally. I'm just going to skip the next little bit to just have a few minutes left to talk about assertion. So the stories, so just to clarify the narrative so far, we have lots of reasons to maintain, lots of reasons to adopt some kind of multiple perspective model to explain a variety of interactional phenomena that have been observed in the linguistics literature. This leaves open the question of whether we still need a representation of common ground to have a full picture of communication. And the sort of best candidates for things that really need that are presupposition and assertion. So I've just given you a way that we can understand the behavior of presupposition in a multiple perspectives model with no representation of common ground. Now let me give like the tiniest hint about how we might think about assertion in a multiple perspectives model without common ground. And this really is something that I've barely started thinking about, but here's some preliminary thoughts. The observation I want to make is that in a multiple perspectives model, we're led to expect 3 different assertion-like moves. And interestingly, these moves kind of correspond to different proposals that have been made in the literature over a long period of time about how assertion works. So here again is our agent maintaining these 2 representations, one of themselves and one of their interlocutor. So this suggests at least 3 different things we might do when we're asserting. One thing you might be interested in doing is simply demonstrating your own perspective, enabling the addressee to know that you believe or are committed to whatever the content of your assertion is. On this view, the goal of assertion is not to update a common ground or even to update your interlocutor's perspective, but merely to reveal your own. But of course, in many cases, when we engage in these assertoric type acts, Our goal is not merely to reveal our self-perspective, but to influence the interlocutor's perspective. And within the structure of this model, that's a very plausible thing that we might be doing. Finally, remember that piece of the theory that I haven't really talked about, the comparison piece. Sometimes, plausibly, sometimes when we make an assertion, we make the assertion with the goal that when our interlocutor gets to the point of carrying out this comparison function cognitively, they will identify sameness of assumptions between self and interlocutor. So that's, a very, very tiny sketch, but that's the direction that I'm hoping to go in, to look at assertion within a multiple perspective model. So I'll just summarize. The goal here was to, promote multiple perspective approaches to modeling communication by first pointing to some further disadvantages of common ground models of informational availability and of presupposition. And on the other hand, articulate the advantages of modeling these phenomena in a multiple perspective approach. And I just want to say as a final note that I find this kind of model very natural, given a broad understanding of communication as intention recognition. So a broadly Gricean understanding of what communication is about. So in this view, utterances serve first and foremost as evidence of the internal state of the speaker, and everything else turns out to be perlocutionary. Okay, that's it. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mandy. That was a great talk. I'm sure there's going to be a lot of questions. So when all the applause dies down, I'll be able to. Okay. So please raise your hand if you would like to ask a question. I hope I can see it. Can I see everybody? Okay, Paul. Paul, you are going to.
Yes, I kept toggling raise question. I never saw it pop. Oh, there it goes. So thank you, Mandy. I really enjoyed your talk a great deal. I'm wondering if I can kind of transcend the scheme of what you're doing, look at it from a broader perspective and ask, how does this project relate to truth conditional semantics? So you're talking about utterances as being evidence of the speaker's mental state. And I can see this being developed in a way that coheres with, the dominant semantic paradigm, truth conditional semantics. And I can see of ways where it might diverge from that. And I'm just wondering if you have any thoughts or feelings about the direction that would go.
So my general picture of how things work is linguistic expressions have conventional meanings that are somewhat more, and some have relatively fixed conventional meanings, and some have meanings that are fairly easy to push around. So when a speaker utters an expression, they have, when they, let's say, a sentential expression, the linguistic the compositional meaning of what they say determines an expression meaning, which then gets filled in by contextual and pragmatic factors. And in some cases, that results in a truth valuable proposition. And in those cases, the speaker becomes committed to the truth of the proposition they've expressed. Does there need to be more to it than that? Am I missing something?
No, I was just curious because the reputation, right, is that mentalist semantics and truth conditional semantics are rival theories. And the way you cast your framework near the end is very mentalistic. So I was just wondering how those fit together in your mind. And I understand now.
Okay.
Okay, Elizabeth and then Brett.
Hi, Mandy. Thanks. It's always so cool to see, how you're thinking about these things is evolving. And I'm curious about kind of like defaults, like taking this to the, to that kind of cognitivist place, I think is really nice. And I'm just thinking about different kinds of either models, the way we model theoretical phenomena, or account for the cognitive import of certain of these phenomena. I'm just trying to think of like, if we have these multi-perspective models and we get rid of the common ground, do the defaults just go back to one side or the other? So to make this more concrete, I'm thinking of, something that I care about a lot, which is the strength of presuppositions to affect long-term memory. And so, I hear a presupposition, or, you presuppose something, I hear it, I attribute it to you, I make a comparison. Let's say it's not in my, sorry, wait, what are you?
Self-perspective.
Yes, my self-perspective. Yes, thank you. But it seems like, I'm just thinking of things like in the, let's say, old way of thinking about things, I'd say, all right, well, when I proffer something, it doesn't enter the common ground unless you say something else that kind of accepts it. But even there, it's still a default moving forward in a way, unless you specifically intervene and say, well, hey, wait a minute, but something to signal that so there's something going on. And if not, whereas like a presupposition or maybe some kinds of conventional implicatures just kind of like glide on in, on their own. And I'm just thinking like that's a powerful way of looking at things, if I want to kind of say, oh, well, that's why you don't notice it. And you get people who like admit things that they didn't do. I mean, because this kind of is insidious. And I'm just thinking like, okay, if I have to make an explicit comparison, how do I then model that? Yeah, anyway, I think you see kind of what I'm getting at. I don't know.
Yeah, I think that was like a lot in that package.
Sorry.
So let me try and say some things. So about this interesting and sort of troubling effect that presuppositions seem to have on people's cognition. Actually, just sort of a side note, I mean, the only work that I've seen on that has to do with like definites versus indefinites. And I would really love somebody to do the same kinds of experiments, but with other kinds of presuppositional experiments. So, okay, maybe we're going to be talking. But I think the point I want to make is that, and the substantive point I think I can make is that I don't think that the common ground model ever really gave us an account of that. Because there's this way of talking, where people say that things get automatically added to the common ground. But there is no way for information, and like I see lots of people nodding, so I'm preaching to the choir here, right? But there is no way for information to somehow automatically become part of the common ground. It can only become part of the common ground by becoming at least an acceptance of each individual agent, and then having this mutual belief about others' beliefs. So I think what needs to be said in the kind of model that I'm now, supporting is there is some kind of default to assume a match between the speaker, between the mental states of the interlocutors, something like that. So I think so what I was suggesting earlier is that maybe there are different assertion-like acts, and one of them is just a kind of demonstration of my current information state, and then the second one is where I assert in order to have you come to share my content. Maybe that, for social rather than linguistic reasons, turns out to be a default assumption about why we engage in assertion. And as I have to accept your presuppositions in order to, typically have to accept your presuppositions in order to also take on, say, the content of an associated assertion, then I'm going to have to update with all of that stuff.
Thanks.
Thank you very much. So I found that really compelling and really interesting. The question I have comes from Lewis's scorekeeping paper. So in the beginning of that paper, he starts by talking about scorekeeping in a baseball game. And the idea roughly is that we have this shared representation, or a presumption of a shared representation of the score of a game, and then he uses that as an analog for conversation. We treat conversation as a similar kind of move-making activity with a common goal, and we have this common scoreboard where we represent the state of the game. And so I was just, in thinking through the proposal, I was trying to think whether we would lose anything by using a multiple perspectives model of a baseball game score. And I was thinking of a case where, let's say we've got kids playing stickball or something, so there's no referee, there's no official scorekeeper that we can defer to. On the face of it, it feels like there's something that would be lost if there was disagreement about what the state of the game is, like who is up at bat, the sorts of things that Lewis felt they should be shared, or that there should be a presumption of sharedness. If two players disagree about what happened, like whether somebody hit a double or not, and they kept playing the game, holding on to their divergent perspectives, it feels like the game would crash to some extent. And so I guess I guess I'm wondering, is it the case that there's a difference here, that we really need the presumption of sharedness in the case of something like a baseball game, but we don't need that presumption of sharedness in the case of a conversation? Or would you say instead that no, in fact, we could import this multiple perspectives model to a baseball scoreboard as well?
I think the first thing, that is, I think in order for the baseball game to proceed, we have to have agreement on, like how many balls there have been, whatever. And indeed, the game breaks down if you have disagreement about that. I think right. So for a baseball game, which is a specific kind of, real world social convention, not finding the right words here, we have to simply agree on there being a fixed scoreboard. Now, and I think that maybe Lewis was thinking that, well, we need to model a conversation, or we need to model a conversation in the same way because we want to model fully successful conversation. But one of the things we know about conversation is that sometimes it does break down. And I mean, I think one thing that distinguishes like the kinds of interests I have from the interests that Stalnaker has is I'm interested in modeling, I'm interested in a descriptive model about what is actually happening, rather than restricting the discussion to normative models where everything goes the way it's supposed to go. That said, the one part of this that I'm still wrestling with and thinking through is how to make sense within this kind of model of the notion of coordination. Because coordination still feels like a real thing that happens. So what does it actually look like if it doesn't involve a common ground? So I'm pretty sure that that part of the story is right, but I still don't have a good fill-in for the coordination part.
Thanks.
Well, it is already past 6:30, which was the scheduled end time for this session, but I don't want to cut anybody else off who has a burning question. Otherwise, despite the fact that, I'd love this conversation to go on for another hour, I guess we should, in the interests of the audience, bring this to a close.
Been a long day.
Been a long day, and thank you so much for a very interesting talk, which once again is, leading us into new territory in really fascinating ways. So thank you so much.
Okay, and thank you all for being here.
Right, and thanks everyone else, and we'll see you tomorrow bright and early at 9 a.m. So have a good night, everybody.
Have a good night, everyone.
Bye. Thanks, Mandy. It was great. Thanks.
Thank you.
Right.